Sometimes, life doesn't give you warnings. It just hits you in the face, no breaks, no mercy. That Friday evening felt like the start of something. I just didn't know what yet. The mirror in my bedroom reflected someone I hadn't recognized in a while. Me, Emma Carter, a 32-year-old wife, teacher, and professional juggler of responsibilities. But that night, I wasn't just any of those things. The fitted emerald dress I slipped into whispered freedom, confidence, something bold. It clung in just the right places, and as I stood there fixing my earrings, I felt alive. Jake, my husband of 6 years, had insisted we join his friends at Blue Ivy, the most buzzed-about bar in downtown Chicago. I wasn't sold on the idea. I hadn't been in the mood for crowded rooms and polite small talk with his coworkers. But Jake had that excited glow about him, like this was going to be the perfect night. I couldn't let him down. By the time we arrived, the city buzzed with its usual weekend rhythm. Neon signs glowed against a glassy skyline, and laughter spilled out of Blue Ivy onto the sidewalk. The place was packed, the kind of trendy spot that felt both electric and suffocating. Jake immediately spotted his group, a boisterous cluster of coworkers and friends near the back. "Emma, you okay?" Jake asked, his hand brushing my arm. "Yeah, fine," I replied, flashing him a quick smile. "Go on, I'll grab a drink first." As Jake drifted off to join his friends, I made my way to the bar, weaving through tables and couples leaning close in dimly lit corners. The music thumped through my chest as I ordered a classic gin and tonic. It wasn't until I turned back toward the room that I felt the first ripple of unease. Will, Jake's best friend, stood not far off. At first, I thought he was just being friendly, offering a casual nod. But then his gaze lingered. It wasn't an accidental glance or a harmless look of recognition. His eyes traced over me in a way that made my stomach tighten, not with butterflies, but something darker, heavier. I tried to brush it off, focusing on sipping my drink, but I could feel it. His eyes burned into me, and when I dared to look again, he was still staring. It was a bold, unapologetic gaze, and for a moment, I didn't know if I was imagining it. Jake's laughter rang out from the far side of the room, and I turned toward it, clinging to that sound like a lifeline. But before I could take a step, Will closed the distance. "Emma," he said, his tone low, almost amused. "You look stunning tonight." It was the way he said it, like he knew something he shouldn't. My breath caught for a moment, and I forced a smile. "Thanks, Will. How's your night going?" "Better now," he replied, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I froze. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the tone, the way he leaned in just slightly, breaking the unspoken bubble of personal space. I should have walked away right then, but I didn't. Maybe I was too polite. Maybe I wanted to believe this was just a harmless misunderstanding. Will tilted his head, his eyes flicking down to my dress before meeting mine again. "Jake's lucky, you know. Not every guy has someone who turns heads like that." There it was, an undeniable line crossed. My pulse spiked, and I swallowed hard. "Will, you're a bit close," I said, my voice firmer this time. But instead of stepping back, he leaned closer, just enough that his breath brushed my cheek. "Am I?" he asked, his voice so soft I barely heard it over the music. I stepped back, forcing space between us. My heart pounded as I clutched my glass tighter. I wanted to find Jake, to let his presence dissolve this strange, suffocating moment. But I couldn't move. "I think I should get back to Jake," I said, my voice shaky but resolute. Will didn't move right away. He stood there, watching me with a smirk that sent a shiver down my spine. "Sure," he said at last, stepping aside as if I'd passed some sort of test. I turned on my heel and walked away, but the heat of his gaze followed me, heavy and unrelenting. By the time I reached Jake, I plastered on a smile, trying to convince myself that I could shake this off. But deep down, I knew something had shifted, and it wasn't over. There's a moment where discomfort becomes undeniable, where every instinct tells you something isn't right. That moment hit me the second Will moved toward me at the bar. He carried himself with an ease that should have been reassuring, but wasn't. His grin, half smirk, half confidence, didn't feel friendly. I kept my focus on my drink, praying he'd pass by, maybe find someone else to talk to. But no. He stopped right in front of me, too close for comfort. "Emma," he said, his voice dripping with familiarity, like we shared some secret. I didn't expect to see you looking like that tonight. I felt my stomach tighten. "Like what?" I asked, forcing a polite smile and pretending I didn't understand what he meant. "Like you're here to steal the show," he said with a chuckle, his eyes scanning me in a way that made my skin crawl. I laughed nervously, brushing it off. "I'm just here to have a good time, Will. Same as everyone else." "Right," he said, leaning in slightly. But not everyone else could pull off that dress. I stiffened, caught between the instinct to run and the urge to confront him. This was Jake's best friend. Someone I'd known for years. Someone who'd been in our wedding photos. This shouldn't be happening. "Thanks," I said flatly, taking a sip of my gin and tonic. I kept my eyes on the crowd, silently pleading for Jake to notice. He didn't. He was deep in conversation, laughing at something one of his coworkers said. Will, however, didn't seem to take the hint. "You know," he said, his tone dropping lower, "it's not often I see you like this. Usually you're," he trailed off, letting his words hang in the air. I turned to face him, raising an eyebrow. "Usually I'm what?" "Usually you're more subdued," he said, his grin widening. "But tonight, Emma, you're radiant." My pulse quickened, not from flattery, but from unease. I couldn't decide if he was just drunk or if this was something darker. Either way, I needed to get out of this conversation. "Will," I said firmly, trying to sound casual, "I think you've had a bit too much to drink." He laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that made you feel better. It was sharp, pointed. "I've had one beer, Emma. Don't try to spin this like I don't know exactly what I'm saying." The air between us felt thick, suffocating. I took a step back, needing space. "Jake's probably wondering where I am," I said, glancing toward my husband's group. "But we'll step closer, closing the distance I'd tried to create." "Jake's not even looking this way," he said quietly, his voice almost daring me to contradict him. I glanced at Jake again, hoping against hope he'd turn around. But no. He was still caught up in the laughter, completely oblivious to what was happening just feet away. "You should go join him," I said, my voice wavering slightly. Will tilted his head, studying me like I was some sort of puzzle he wanted to solve. "You're not comfortable, are you?" "No," I said honestly, taking another step back. His smirk faltered, replaced by something more serious. "Relax," he said, raising his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "I'm just messing with you." But he wasn't. Not really. He lingered for a second longer before finally stepping aside. I watched him walk away, relief washing over me as the tension broke. But it wasn't over, not even close. Back at the table, Jake looked up as I approached. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed slightly. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just needed a drink." He didn't push further, thankfully, but my mind was spinning. Will had crossed a line, one I couldn't unsee, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Will watching me again from across the room. His expression wasn't apologetic. If anything, he looked amused, like he'd won some invisible game I hadn't agreed to play. And as much as I wanted to shake it off, I couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. Sometimes, silence feels louder than words. And that night, the silence between me and Will was deafening. It was loaded, pulsing with something I couldn't name, and I hated that it made my chest tighten. I felt him before I saw him. That shift in the air when someone enters your space. I'd barely sipped my drink when Will appeared beside me again, this time standing even closer than before. Close enough that the faint scent of his cologne reached me, earthy, sharp, undeniably intentional. "Back so soon?" I asked, my voice steady even though I didn't feel steady at all. I couldn't stay away, he replied smoothly, his lips curling into that ever-present smirk. I rolled my eyes, trying to deflect. You're laying it on thick tonight, huh? Am I? His tone was light, but his eyes were anything but. I just call it like I see it. I glanced away, pretending to scan the room, searching for Jake. He wasn't looking. Of course he wasn't. Will stepped even closer, his shoulder brushing mine. I stiffened, but he didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did, and he just didn't care. You've got everyone staring, he said, his voice low enough that I had to lean in slightly to catch it. But they don't see you the way I do. Will, I said sharply, turning to face him. Don't. But he didn't back off. If anything, my reaction seemed to encourage him. He tilted his head, studying me like he was trying to figure out my breaking point. Relax, he said, his voice dripping with feigned innocence. I'm just giving you a compliment. It wasn't just a compliment, and we both knew it. I started to respond, but then he reached out, his hand brushing against mine on the edge of the bar. It was subtle, fleeting, so quick I might have convinced myself it was an accident if not for the way his fingers lingered just a fraction too long. My breath caught, my stomach twisting in a way that was anything but pleasant. Will, I repeated, this time quieter. He leaned in, just close enough that his words felt private, intimate. You sure Jake doesn't mind you wearing that dress? I froze. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the way he said them, like they were some kind of dare. Like he was daring me to respond. What's that supposed to mean? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Will shrugged, his smirk widening. Nothing. Just you know how protective he is. That's enough, I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my best effort to sound firm. But Will didn't move. Instead, he shifted even closer, his voice dropping so low it was practically a whisper. You can't tell me you didn't notice the way every guy in here looks at you. Or maybe, he paused, his eyes locking with mine. You like it? My heart pounded in my chest, anger and disbelief swirling together in a chaotic storm. I wanted to snap at him, to shove him away, but I couldn't move. I'm done with this conversation, I said finally, stepping back. My voice didn't sound like my own. Will chuckled, a soft, infuriating sound. Sure, he said, stepping aside just enough to let me pass. But you know I'm right. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I walked away, gripping my drink so tightly I thought the glass might shatter. When I found Jake, I felt like I could finally breathe again. He was laughing with his coworkers, his arm casually draped over the back of his chair. Completely unaware. Hey, there you are, he said, smiling up at me. Everything okay? Yeah, I lied, forcing a smile as I slid into the seat beside him. Just needed a moment. But even as Jake pulled me closer, even as his laugh filled the air, I couldn't shake the weight of Will's words. His touch still lingered, faint and unwelcome, and I hated how it made my skin crawl. Across the room, Will stood near the bar, his drink in hand. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel him there, like a shadow that refused to fade. This wasn't over. There are moments that test you, moments where every instinct screams to run, to push away, to make it stop. But sometimes, the weight of shock roots you in place. That's exactly where I found myself when Will crossed yet another line. Jake had gone to the bar to grab another round, leaving me momentarily alone at the table. I told myself it was fine. Will had been keeping his distance, or at least pretending to. I thought maybe he'd gotten the hint. I was wrong. I saw him approaching out of the corner of my eye, moving with that same irritating confidence, his smirk firmly in place. My stomach knotted instantly. Emma, he said casually, sliding into the seat beside me without so much as an invitation. Still enjoying yourself? Will, I started, my tone sharp. This isn't the time. He cut me off, leaning closer until his shoulder brushed mine. Relax. I just came to talk. About what? I asked, crossing my arms, trying to create some sort of barrier between us. He tilted his head, as if considering his answer. About how a night like this can feel predictable, don't you think? I stiffened, instantly on edge. What's that supposed to mean? Come on, Emma, he said, his voice dropping to that low, almost conspiratorial tone. The same people, the same conversations. Doesn't it ever feel stale? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, his hand grazed my lower back, his fingers lingering just long enough to make my breath hitch. Will, stop, I said firmly, shifting away. But he didn't listen. He leaned in even closer, his lips dangerously near my ear. What if we made tonight a little more interesting? Interesting. My voice was barely above a whisper, and my hands curled into fists at my sides. He chuckled softly, his breath warm against my skin. You and me. We could slip out of here just for a little while. Jake doesn't have to know. My heart stopped. The sheer audacity of his words left me frozen, unable to comprehend what he'd just suggested. He couldn't be serious. You're out of your mind, I said, forcing the words out, my voice shaking with equal parts anger and disbelief. Am I? He replied smoothly, leaning back just enough to meet my eyes. Or am I just saying what we're both thinking? I stared at him, horrified.
We're not both thinking it, I snapped.
Not even close. He shrugged, his smirk unfazed. You're tense, Emma. You need to loosen up. One night. That's all I'm saying. His hand moved again, this time settling on my waist. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. And it was the final straw. Get your hand off me, I hissed, my voice low but furious. For a moment he didn't move, and I thought I might actually scream. But then he leaned back, raising his hands in mock surrender. All right, he said with a laugh. No need to make a scene. A scene. That's what he was worried about. Not the way he'd disrespected me, not the way he'd disrespected Jake, but whether anyone was watching. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint, but I needed to get away from him. Emma, he called after me, his tone laced with amusement. Don't be mad. I was just teasing. Teasing? The word felt like a slap in the face. I didn't stop to respond. I didn't even look back. I wove through the crowd, my breaths coming in short, shallow bursts, until I found Jake at the bar. Hey, he said, smiling when he saw me. Everything okay?
Fine, I lead, forcing a smile.
Just needed to stretch my legs. He handed me a drink, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I wanted to tell him everything, to grab him by the arm and make him look at Will, to demand that he see what I was dealing with. But I couldn't. Not yet. Across the room, Will was watching, his expression smug and unreadable. I could still feel the weight of his hand on my waist, the heat of his breath, the words he'd whispered. It wasn't just a bad joke or a misunderstanding. It was a threat, an invitation, a line he'd crossed without hesitation. And I had no idea what to do next. It was like time slowed down. The noise of the bar faded, the laughter, the music, the clinking glasses, all of it blurred into a low hum. All I could focus on was Will and the suffocating weight of his words. Emma, he said softly, his voice meant only for me. Don't look at me like that. You know what I'm saying makes sense. Just one night. Nobody will know. He was so close, too close. His hand still rested on my waist, his touch deliberate and firm, like he was daring me to stop him. My breath hitched, a mix of anger, disbelief, and panic swirling inside me. Will, I said, my voice trembling but sharp.
Let me go.
For a moment he didn't move, his smirk unwavering. His hand lingered, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my chest. My entire body screamed for me to push him away, to shout at him, to cause a scene if I had to. But I was frozen. Relax, he said, his tone too smooth, too casual. It's just us talking. What's wrong with that? What's wrong? I snapped, finally stepping back and breaking his hold, is that you don't seem to understand boundaries. You're way out of line. His smirk faltered for the briefest second, but it returned just as quickly, sharper, colder. He leaned in again, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent chills down my spine. You can tell yourself whatever you want, he said. But I see it in your eyes. You feel it too. The audacity of his words hit me like a punch. My chest tightened, my fingers trembling as I gripped the edge of the bar. You're insane, I managed to say, my voice barely audible over the roar of blood in my ears. Am I? He countered, stepping closer again. Or are you just afraid to admit it? I couldn't do this. I couldn't keep standing there, letting him chip away at my resolve. My entire world felt like it was teetering on a razor's edge, and if I let him push any further, I didn't know what would happen. You need to stop, I said, my voice firmer now. Jake is my husband, your best friend. Do you even realize what you're doing? For a moment, I thought my words might get through to him. His smirk faded, replaced by something almost resembling thoughtfulness. But then he laughed, a quiet, humorless sound that made my stomach turn. Jake doesn't have to know, he said. That's the beauty of it, Emma. This can be ours.
Ours.
The word felt like poison. You're disgusting, I said, my voice shaking with anger now. Do you even hear yourself? Will didn't flinch. He just tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to read my mind. You can hate me all you want, he said. But it doesn't change the fact that I see you. I see the way you look at me when you think no one's watching. Don't pretend you haven't thought about it. My hand clenched into a fist at my side, my entire body trembling with rage and humiliation. You're wrong, I spat. I've never thought about you. Not once. And I never will. His smirk finally broke, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. He leaned in one last time, his voice so low it barely reached me. We'll see, he said, his tone almost a challenge. You can only lie to yourself for so long. I couldn't take it anymore. Without another word, I turned on my heel and pushed my way through the crowd, my chest heaving as I tried to put as much distance as possible between us. Jake found me a few minutes later, standing by the edge of the room near the entrance, clutching my drink like it was a lifeline. Hey, he said, his brow furrowing in concern. You all right? You look a little pale. I'm fine, I lied, my voice steadier than I felt. It's just hot in here. Jake reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was so gentle, so kind, everything Will's wasn't. You sure you want to stay? He asked. I hesitated, the truth burning in the back of my throat. I wanted to tell him everything, to let him know what Will had done, the way he'd crossed every line imaginable. But I couldn't. Not here, not now. Not with Will still somewhere in the room, watching us. I'm fine, I said again, forcing a smile. Let's just finish the night. Jake smiled back, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He didn't push me, though. He just wrapped an arm around me and led me back to the table. But even as I sat there, pretending to enjoy the conversation, pretending everything was fine, I could feel Will's presence like a shadow. This wasn't over. I knew it. And the worst part?
So did he.
By the time we left Blue Ivy, I was desperate for normalcy. The fresh night air hit me like a slap, and I inhaled deeply, hoping it would flush out the toxic weight of Will's presence. Jake held my hand as we walked to the car, laughing about something one of his coworkers had said. I smiled at the right moments, nodded when appropriate, but my mind was anywhere but here. Will's words still echoed in my head, looping like a broken record. This can be ours. His audacity, his smug certainty, it all clung to me like a stain I couldn't wash away. We got home, and Jake immediately collapsed onto the couch, scrolling through his phone while I lingered in the kitchen, pretending to clean up just to keep myself busy. My phone buzzed on the counter, and for a fleeting second, I thought it might be a message from one of my friends. But it wasn't. The notification glared at me, the sender's name unmistakable.
Will.
My stomach dropped, and I hesitated before picking up the phone. My hands shook as I swiped to unlock it, dreading what I might see. You can't pretend nothing happened. I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing happened. That was the truth. But the way he said it made me feel like I was complicit in some unspoken agreement. Like I'd done something wrong just by existing in his orbit. I locked my phone quickly, shoving it into my pocket, as if that could erase the message or him. Everything okay? Jake's voice startled me, and I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. Yeah, I said quickly, plastering on a smile. Just tired. Jake raised an eyebrow, but he didn't push. Come sit with me, he said, patting the spot next to him on the couch. I wanted to sink into the safety of his presence, let the sound of his voice drown out the turmoil in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Will's shadow had followed me home. The next morning, I woke up early, hoping the sunlight might somehow purge the unease that had settled deep in my chest. But as I stood in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring out the window, my phone buzzed again. It was him. You're thinking about it. I know you are. I clenched the phone so tightly I thought it might crack. How could he do this? How could he act like this was some mutual secret we were sharing? For the rest of the day, I tried to keep myself distracted. I cleaned, ran errands, even went to lunch with a friend. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the weight of Will's message. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, even when it wasn't him. By evening, Jake and I were back at Blue Ivy, some sort of impromptu celebration with his coworkers. I didn't want to go, but Jake had been so excited about it that I couldn't say no. When we walked in, I immediately scanned the room, my chest tightening when I spotted Will near the bar. He wasn't looking at me. Not yet, but the tension in the air was palpable. I tried to focus on Jake, on the conversation around me, but it was impossible. Every time I glanced up, Will's eyes were on me. Not constant, but calculated, like he was waiting for the exact moment I would notice. It was suffocating. Emma, Jake said, breaking me out of my thoughts. You okay? You've been quiet. Just tired, I said again, the life feeling heavier with every repetition. Jake frowned slightly, but before he could say anything, someone called his name, and he was pulled into another conversation. I exhaled quietly, trying to steady myself, but my hands were still shaking. It wasn't long before Will made his move. He waited until Jake's back was turned, then slipped into the space beside me, his presence like an unwelcome ghost. You're good at pretending, he said softly, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I didn't look at him. Go away, Will. Is that really what you want? He asked, leaning in closer. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he knew exactly how much power he held in this moment. I turned to face him, my anger finally bubbling to the surface. Yes, I said firmly, my voice barely louder than a whisper. It's exactly what I want. Leave me alone. His smirk faltered, but only for a second. You can't ignore this forever, Emma, he said, his eyes locked on mine. You know that, don't you? I felt the air leave my lungs, my resolve wavering for just a moment before I turned and walked away. I didn't care if anyone saw. I needed to get out of there. As I stood outside in the cool night air, I tried to catch my breath. My heart was racing, my hands trembling, and the weight of Will's words still hung heavy over me. This wasn't just a bad night or an awkward misunderstanding. This was a battle I hadn't asked for, one I wasn't sure how to fight. And as much as I wanted to believe it was over, I knew deep down it wasn't. You'd think time would make it easier, that if you could just hold on long enough, the knots in your chest would untangle and the weight on your shoulders would ease. But time didn't heal this. It only magnified the cracks. I hadn't spoken to Will since that night at Blue Ivy. After his last attempt to corner me, I ignored every message, every unspoken threat lingering in his smug glances. But silence didn't erase what happened. It didn't take away the guilt that clung to me, or the way Jake's touch now felt heavy instead of comforting. It started small. Jake would catch me zoning out at dinner or fidgeting with my phone, and I'd feel his eyes on me, studying me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Everything okay?" he'd ask, his voice careful, like he already knew the answer. "Yeah, just tired," I'd reply, the lie tumbling out on autopilot. But it wasn't just tiredness, and we both knew it. I wasn't sleeping. Every night, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of Will's words circling in my mind. "You can't pretend nothing happened." And the worst part? He was right. Nothing had physically happened, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the lingering question of what if. The guilt of knowing I'd let the situation escalate as far as it did, the shame of freezing when I should have walked away. One night, Jake came home late from work. I was sitting on the couch, staring at a TV show I wasn't really watching. I didn't even hear him come in until he spoke. "Emma," he said softly, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, his brow furrowed. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile. "How was work?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over and sat down beside me, his hand resting on my knee. "You've been distant," he said finally, his tone gentle but firm. "What's going on?" My heart skipped a beat, panic flooding my chest. "Nothing," I said quickly. "I've just been stressed." Jake tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Stressed about what?" "You can talk to me, you know." I looked away, my throat tightening. How could I possibly tell him? How could I explain that his best friend had crossed every line imaginable, that I'd been too stunned, too weak to stop it sooner? That every moment of silence since then had been a wall between us, growing taller by the day? "I'm fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Emma," he said again, more insistent this time. "You're not fine. I know you. Something's wrong. Please, just tell me." I wanted to. God. I wanted to spill everything, to let him see the storm that had been tearing me apart. But the words wouldn't come. "I can't," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. Jake's face softened, but the concern in his eyes only deepened. "Why not?" "Because it would destroy us. Because if I told him, he'd never look at me the same way again. Because I couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes." "Just trust me," I said, my voice breaking.
"Please, Jake."
"Just trust me." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he nodded slowly, his hand tightening on my knee. "I do trust you," he said quietly. "But I need you to trust me too. When you're ready, Emma. Whatever it is, just tell me when you're ready." I nodded, the tears spilling over as I leaned into his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around me, holding me close, and for a moment I felt safe. But that safety was a lie. The weeks that followed were a blur of forced normalcy. I went through the motions: work, dinner, outings with Jake. But every time I smiled, every time I laughed, I felt like a fraud. The secret sat heavy in my chest, and no matter how hard I tried to bury it, it was always there. Will, of course, didn't make it easier. I saw him at gatherings, his smirks and knowing glances like tiny daggers. He never pushed again, not directly, but his presence was enough to remind me that I couldn't escape this. One evening, I caught Jake watching me as I cleaned up after dinner. His expression wasn't angry or suspicious, just sad. It was the look of someone who knew something was wrong, but didn't know how to fix it. "Emma," he said softly, and I froze, the plate in my hand trembling.
"What?"
I asked, my voice tight. "I miss you," he said simply. The words hit me like a punch, and I turned away quickly, blinking back tears. "I'm still here," I said, my voice hollow.
"No," he said.
"You're not." That night, as I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, I realized he was right. I wasn't here. Not really. Will had stolen something from me that night at Blue Ivy. my sense of peace, my trust in myself. And I had let him. Jake shifted in his sleep, his hand brushing mine, and the weight of the secret pressed harder on my chest. I couldn't keep this up. Not forever. But whether I told him or not, one thing was certain. My life, our life, would never be the same again.